Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Friday and welcome to Fairytale Fridays. This week we are discussing the Emperor's New Clothes, because if there is one fairy tale that exemplifies the spirit of our age, it is this one. The vanity, the posturing, the willful blindness, pretending and ignoring the blindingly obvious for no other reason than it would be very embarrassing for people who ought to have known better to actually fess up to their mistakes. But in the simplest of terms that even a small child could understand, this story does an outstanding job explaining why people indulge in foolishness and why they persist in foolishness. This is particularly significant because oftentimes, whenever something preposterous takes place, which seems to be almost a daily occurrence, people are left asking, why? In the name of sanity, why? Well, this story provides that answer, and it doesn't reflect well on anyone who is in this story. But we can benefit from the lesson, and frankly, as adults, we need to take this lesson more seriously even than children should. I mean, the children need to absorb it for sure, but we need to actually put it into practice. And as we see in the tale itself, it was the adults who failed to react appropriately, and it was a child who was willing to speak the truth of the matter. Now, The Emperor's New Clothes was published in 1837 by Hans Christian Andersen, and the story does originate in Denmark. But let's get into the story itself. I'll be sprinkling in some comments and reflections as we go along. So, once upon a time, there was an emperor who was obsessed with his wardrobe, loved anything new, and spent all his money on clothes. He neglected his soldiers. He didn't care about the arts. The only time he was out and about was for the purpose of showing off his clothes, and he had something different to wear at all times of the day. Where other kings could be found in their council chambers, this emperor could only be found in his wardrobe. So right off the bat, we've got a clear picture of the status quo in this kingdom. The fearless leader is consumed with frivolity, with wasteful spending, and he is neglecting his duties. By ignoring the military, we know he's not concerned with the country's defense. He's not meeting with his ministers. That tells us he's not running the administrative part of the state. He's spending all of his money on clothes instead of on more important matters, so we know the money management is probably really messed up. And he isn't even at the theater, so he's not supporting the nation's culture. Everything that enables a country to exist successfully and thrive is being ignored by this particular sovereign, and that leads to the trajectory of a society that's headed for very troubling times. So, going on with the story. Apparently, the emperor's vanity was so well known that two con men waltzed into the kingdom one day with a plot to enrich themselves and make a fool of the emperor. They told everyone that they were master weavers and they could create the most beautiful cloth and the most beautiful clothes ever seen. Their colors and patterns were not to be compared with anything else, and this cloth was only visible to people of intelligence and who were well suited to their jobs. Only the simple-minded and the incompetent would be unable to see it. I mean, isn't that just fantastic? And the most effective lies are packaged in this way. It's something that's presented as self-evident truth, and that those who disagree or don't see it or deny it are foolish, dishonest, immoral even, people whose judgment cannot be relied upon and who ought to be ignored. And this appeals to people's vanity because they want something new that separates them from the rabble, and it assures that when they notice something is wrong, that they'll keep their mouth shut for fear of the judgment of others who are also posturing in the exact same way. It is a self-sustaining cycle as long as no one admits that they are not seeing what they can actually see with their own eyes. And the longer people try to protect this position and the false premise upon which it's built, the lie can just go on and on and on and on. So the emperor heard about the claims of these so-called weavers and thought it would be marvelous to have such clothes. With a suit made of this cloth, he'd be able to tell who was wise and who was foolish, who was capable in their job and who was unfit. He immediately ordered cloths from the con men and gave them quite a bit of money, as well as quite a bit of material. And then the weavers, they set up their workshop, they pretended to be busy, and they asked to, just give us the best silks and thread made of gold. And with all of this, they stashed away the silks and the thread in their little knapsacks hidden away. And then they made a great show of working at making the emperor's cloth, even though they weren't actually doing anything at all. But, they were definitely sitting at the looms and they were pretending to weave and putting, a lot of effort into that particular deception. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with this chain of events. First, the emperor is mentally absent from his post, and as a consequence, he is looking for something external to farm out his thinking process, instead of just taking a good look at his advisors, the military, state of the culture, the budget, and the people, and just forming his own conclusions based upon what he can see. He's instead going to rely on this magical cloth so he doesn't have to think. When someone is known to evade their most basic obligations, and thinking being chiefly amongst those obligations, then people will come along who have bad intentions, and their whole goal will be to take advantage of this. And that's just the way that it is. And they will put on a show, and they'll keep the person, off balance, and anything that helps them continue to choose not to think, they will encourage that. And I want to stress how vulnerable this makes an individual. Because when people get themselves into a mess, quite often you'll find that one of the first steps that put them on this bad path was a desire to not think, to not pay attention to what was actually taking place around them, and everything else flowed from that. So next, the emperor got curious about how the work was proceeding, but he was a little bit worried. He didn't want to show up himself just in case, he couldn't see what was there to be seen. He had been assured that simpletons and those unfit for office wouldn't be able to see the cloth. And now he tried to tell himself that, of course, he'd be fine. But he ultimately decided he preferred to send somebody else to check on the progress. And he also knew that the whole kingdom was talking about this remarkable cloth, and everyone was really keen to find out how wise or foolish their neighbors were. So he was committed to this project. So the emperor sends out one of his counselors, an older fellow who was known to be both faithful and wise, to see about this cloth. He considered no one to be better at his post than this counselor, so surely he would come back and tell him what's what. Now, this sense of insecurity is quite revealing. On some level, the emperor already understands that he falls short of the ideal, but instead of addressing his weaknesses and working to improve himself, he's just wanting to evade the issue. That's why he decides to send someone else to check on the weavers. He's afraid of losing face, especially since his entire kingdom has bought into these wild claims. And sending in the old man isn't a compliment to this particular counselor. It's a litmus test. The emperor thinks he can rely upon this person and what he says, which is just another way of farming out his thinking process and replacing it with someone else's. So the old man goes to the workroom where the thieves are busily pretending. He sees the empty looms and he's just taken aback. He says nothing. And then the con men begin to invite him to examine the cloth, this invisible cloth, and what did he think of the colors and the patterns and so on and so forth. And the old man just stared at the empty looms, and he began to be quite fearful. Oh, well, maybe I am a fool after all, or maybe I'm unfit for my duties. So he decided that no one else could know this, least of all the emperor, and he began to pretend that he could see the cloth, and he complimented it highly and how wonderful it was. The weavers talked all about the pattern, the quality of the cloth, and why they chose the colors that they did. And the old man paid very close attention so he could repeat those details to the emperor. And the con men continued to pretend to do their work. But they weren't doing anything at all, of course. And here's where we come to additional layers of betrayal in this particular story. I mean, we've already discussed the failings of the emperor, which is bad enough, and clearly the society has become completely conditioned to just expect nothing more from him. But now we have a public official letting people down because he was brought in to that premise just enough that only the competent and the intelligent can see this cloth. So he's willing to abandon the evidence of his own eyes out of fear of how others might react and how it could result in the loss of his position, prestige, and expose him to mockery. This is the response of a weak character and a lack of integrity. And it also teaches that it isn't enough to have the outward appearance of wisdom, or to be of an age in which you ought to have wisdom. Substance is required, and without that substance, there's no basis for trust. So the old man goes and he makes his report to the delight of the emperor, and soon afterwards the emperor sent along another court official to find out when his new suit would be finished. The official goes into the workroom, and just like the wise man, he saw absolutely nothing on the looms. But he had absolute faith in his faculties. He knew, like, okay, I know I'm not dumb. So he decided, maybe it's just I'm not good at my job, and that's why I can't see it. So he resolved that no one would ever know of that. And like the wise man before him, the court official just praised this cloth to the skies, saying how delightful the pattern and colors were. And he gave a glowing account to the emperor about how magnificent everything was. And meanwhile, the whole city was buzzing about the cloth, getting really into this. So, first lesson from this is that politicians are not to be trusted, and the court official provides yet another example of that. When he decides that his job could be in jeopardy owing to his supposed incompetence, his solution wasn't to resign his post or to expose the fraud of the con men, but rather to prevent other people from discovering his incompetence. And this is the same old story we see over and over again, both in storytelling and in real life. It's vital not to lose sight of that and not to fall in the trap of looking for honor or reliability in politics, because we won't find it. It isn't there to be found. And if the choice comes down to doing what's right or keeping their job, politicians will choose the path that enables them to retain power. So at last, the emperor then decides to go see for himself of what kind of cloth his money has bought him. He gathered a number of his court officials, and they all went down, and this was including the two who had brought him, these wonderful reports, and they went down to the workroom to see how the cloth looked while it was still on the loom. And then the weavers saw this retinue approach, and they increased their appearance of busyness. And even though there was not anything on the loom, not so much as a single thread, they were busily doing all their stuff and pretending to operate the loom and doing all this. And then after the retinue comes in and we have the wise old man and the court official, they were pointing at the looms. They were thinking that everyone else could see what they couldn't. And they just exclaimed what a fine cloth it was and invited the emperor to admire it. But the emperor couldn't see anything either. And he was horrified to realize this, but he wasn't about to admit to it. So the emperor declared his complete approval of the cloth. He was very enthusiastic about it, and all of the other court officials were exclaiming how charming and delightful it was. And they were straining their eyes to see this, but they couldn't see it because there was nothing to see. But that didn't stop them from complimenting it, and they went so far as to advise the emperor that he simply must have a suit of clothes made from this cloth so that he could wear it at the upcoming parade. Here we see more of the court proving themselves to be completely unreliable and more than willing to accommodate an illusion for fear of personal embarrassment. And this is not at all the kind of people that a ruler actually needs to have in their circle, but more often than not, this is exactly what they end up getting. And then we have the emperor himself. He was in the best position of anyone to put an end to the foolishness and the fraud. But instead of that, instead of trusting his own eyes, he clung to his insecurities and his fear, and this enabled the deception to continue on. And the suggestion that this cloth should be used to make clothes the emperor would wear to a parade, that represents taking the chain of events to the next level. Is the emperor and the court willing to take this lie to the general public and just see how it fares? So the emperor did decide that it was a splendid idea to make a parade clothes from this unmatched cloth, and he went so far as to grant the weavers orders of knighthood for their efforts. Knighthood! Sir Weaver and Sir also a Weaver. Can you imagine? And at this point, he was completely unaware that these weavers, they had stashed away all the materials they were given, and they were intending to run off with them at the end of this particular fraud. And then the night before the parade, the weavers, they stayed up all night. They were burning all kinds of candles, pretending to roll the cloth off the room, pretending to then sew. And then they finally announced the clothes were ready. And by this point in the story, the emperor is truly desperate to save face. And obviously, he thinks the only way to do that is to lean into this belief about the cloth and carry on as if everything were normal. And everyone in the court is also playing along. And you've got to give the con men credit for their commitment to their lie. They've been going through all the motions all this time. And sometimes in life, we observe people with the same commitment to their own lies or to their own delusions. No one can say they aren't putting in the work. But all the devotion in the world cannot transform a falsehood into truth. And that's a reality that often gets lost in the shuffle. But sooner or later, reality is always there to be found. So the emperor comes to the workroom, together with all of the grandees of his court. And the weavers made a great show of, they were holding up their arms as if they were showing off the clothes, all their hard work. Oh, here are your majesty's trousers, and look at this scarf, and look at this mantle. Isn't it splendid? We worked so hard for you. And then, very cleverly, they declared that the clothes were as light as a cobweb, and the emperor might feel as though he was wearing nothing at all once he put them on. So the emperor is stripped down to his undergarments, and the weavers proceed to dress him and perform a last-minute tailoring of the clothes. And the court admired how magnificent the emperor looked, how wonderful the fit was, and he was then admiring himself in the mirror. And then he declared he was ready to appear at the parade. So the lords of the bedchamber pretended to pick up the ends of his mantle because they didn't want it said that they were idiots or unable to do their jobs, and so they pretended to carry his train. The emperor paraded through his capital in this fashion, and the people pretended to admire his clothes. No one wanted it said that they were lacking intelligence or incapable of doing their jobs properly, so everyone just played along. And just imagine the scene. A monarch who should be at the very least presenting a facade of dignity. He's marching through the streets, serenely waving to the crowds, pretending he's wearing the greatest clothes in the history of clothes, while in reality wearing nothing more than his skivvies. Wonderful. And not only is the royal court walking along in this parade and pretending like everything is normal, but the people themselves are participating in the illusion. They're cheering, they're shouting their compliments, they're going along with everything, and they're denying what their eyes are telling them. This is the power of peer pressure in action and the danger of conformity. Reality gets tossed out the window, and people reassure each other that what is hogwash is actually truth and that lies are facts. Nice little feedback loop there. But then a little child in the crowd exclaimed, "The emperor has no clothes!" And the crowd gasped. And then the father of the child said that everyone should listen to the child. And whispers went through the crowd. And at last the people as a whole, one and all, declared that the child was correct. And the emperor was wearing nothing at all. And the emperor was aghast because he knew it was true. Even he knew it was true, even if it was humiliating to be so exposed in public. But he reasoned that the parade must go on, and so he continued to walk through the streets. And his train carriers made a show of pretending to continue to carry this train for fear of being accused of being unfit for duty, and the emperor just went on, walking the streets of his own capital and nothing more than his underwear. Well done, all. So, children are capable of moments of great honesty. They are willing to name uncomfortable things that no one else in the room wishes to acknowledge. Sometimes this is intensely annoying, and other times it is a great service, as it was in the case of this story. Because by the child saying this, it shook people back to their senses, and it gave them the confidence to acknowledge the obvious. It's like waking up out of a dream and coming back to the actual world. But despite this, despite realizing the mistake, the emperor didn't turn back or apologize or even acknowledge what had happened. He kept right on walking, pretending nothing was wrong, and his courtiers followed suit. Can you think of another story that better encapsulates our age? Don't trust your eyes or your own judgments. Conform to what others do and say. Don't step out of line for fear you'll be punished. Those who do point out the obvious and declares that reality is real are often the people who are least likely to be taken seriously in society, much like the child in our story. But once the process starts and someone is willing to name the unnameable, this then spreads to others, who begin to acknowledge reality until finally a significant enough number of the public no longer buys into the delusion and makes that sentiment known. It is significant, isn't it, that the elites in this story continue to maintain the pretense even after the people have rejected it. Isn't that what we see happen every day? And this isn't a coincidence. They truly think they have no other choice than to carry on with the insanity, because the moment they stop, that will be the moment that they stop wielding power. It will be the end of their careers, the end of their influence, the end of them ever mattering ever again. And they just can't and they won't face it. Now, we don't know what happens after the Emperor's parade finishes up or what the mood in the palace would be like, but at a guess, I would suspect that everyone there just puts it behind them and the whole affair is never mentioned again. And the weavers run off with their loot to sell in another locale, and they probably go on to perform other schemes elsewhere. No one who is at the center of the situation learned the lesson, and they probably didn't reflect on the events or the part they played in it. And for that matter, the townspeople, the ones who began by praising the emperor's clothes before acknowledging that he was actually roaming the streets in his underwear, they probably didn't learn anything either. To understand this and why it happens is to understand why patterns repeat. It is an exceptional thing to actually buck the trend and say, no, I'm actually trusting my own senses and that's what I'm going by. But even though most people choose not to have the backbone necessary to do that, that very thing is the task and the test of being a human being. We should at least try to do that. We should try to operate within the scheme of our own judgment. We should try not to ignore that which is blindingly obvious in our faces. We should try not to go along with the crowd just because we could perceive a benefit for doing so, or because we fear punishment if we don't go along with it. It's asking us really to be better than what human beings tend to be when they're just kind of rambling through life. So, a lot to unpack there. I would be very curious to hear your own thoughts about it. Let me know in the comments below. Or even better, go to the description box and click on the link to our Gilded server. It's called Blackbird's Brew. We have a myriad of categories, lots of channels within those categories on various pagan and witchcraft related topics. There's lots for you to explore. If you come over it, you are welcome to add material in there to start discussions, get acquainted with people, and help us be part of our efforts to really form a proper community. Community where people actually talk to each other and get to know each other a little bit. We're trying to create an oasis, so I hope you'll come and see us soon. But that'll do it for this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.